Hello there ladies and gents, and welcome to the 6th part of the World Builder Wiki video series with me, MonolithicBacon. In this particular part we're going to be focusing on the Spline tool and all variants of the Spline tool. What you'll notice is, if you're following our written wiki, is that we'll be going over several steps, some of them later steps of the guide. The reason why I wanted to do this is going over the Spline tool back and forth seems like a waste of time when we can easily cover the 3 different types of splines in one fell swoop. When it comes down to it, they aren't particularly difficult to master either, even though the 3 of them have very different roles, and this should be a nice and simple process to get us through, just in case you wanted to use them earlier in your design. Welcome back to our map 2-Player Flood. When we were last here, we were finishing off with the tile editor, and as you can see, I have covered our map in a very basic set of layers for the tiles. Down near the water, I've used mud and marshy grasses, whereas as promised, up in the top, I've used more pebbles, dry dirt, and cobblestones. Even though this is something we'll come back to in future parts, for now I wanted to focus on these splines, in particular the roadways here that have been in the designer texture since the very beginning. If you go on to the spline placement tool, which again looks like the black line with yellow lines inside it, look almost like a road, you'll be able to select all the splines that you've previously placed. Now, as before, you'll notice that there's 3 modes, 3 buttons on the top here. We're going to go through the texture mode to begin with, followed by the object, and then the deform. If you left click on the texture to begin with, just to make sure that the texture editor is lined up, you should be able to select with the left click one of your current splines, and then if you remember rightly, you should be able to go through the list of textures at the bottom here and assign something. Now, we had previously assigned this particular texture, the road designer, and what we're going to look for this time is a suitable replacement for it, an actual road. Now, in Company of Heroes 2 in particular, there are plenty of road textures to choose from. However, you'll notice that some of the folders here have NM on them. For example, if you look at NM tracks, even though the splines inside here don't necessarily have NM at the beginning of it, the folder does. And even though I've not had this personally verified, I've always believed that this stands for no modifier, which means those splines will not actually affect the gameplay in any way. They are just there visually. Those folders that don't have that, however, may contain something that do have modifiers. If you go on to road asphalt in particular, and this is where I'd recommend you look for roads above all, you will notice that some of them, in particular down here, will have the suffix cover. So road muddy spline cover and road sandy spline cover will particularly load up a texture that gives a negative cover bonus, or not really much of a bonus since it's negative cover. If we use road sandy spline as the example, you left click on the texture you want and then hit assign. It will load up the new texture, and right now you won't actually be able to see whether or not it affects gameplay. And that is where we'll come across another little cheeky overlay. If you go on to the overlay toolbar, you should see one that says terrain cover. If I click on terrain cover, it will change my overlay, but you'll notice straight away that this road is bright red, and that means it is going to issue negative cover. There are very few other things that can actually give negative cover besides roads, but if I scroll down, you'll also notice that water has been highlighted in blue. And that, in particular, is because that water will also issue a modifier. In this case, it just so happens to also be negative cover. If I place a crater, which we'll see when I end up using the splat tool later on in these videos, the overlay will come up in yellow instead. Either way, if you use a road spline and you are not entirely sure whether or not it has a modifier on it, simply just go on overlay and then terrain cover and see whether or not it leaves behind any red. If it does, feel free to use it. If you don't want to have modifiers at all, if you would rather your roads not affect the gameplay, then also check this to see whether or not any modifiers are left behind. But if you are unaware negative cover on roadways in particular, not in water, but on roadways, will issue a speed bonus for vehicles. And even though it doesn't issue any speed changes to infantry, it will make infantry far more susceptible to suppression and damage. If an infantry squad happens to be crossing a road like this one here, and is caught by a burst from an MG, they will be suppressed dramatically faster. You'll also notice that some models may die very quick in comparison to normal. So having key areas covered with roadways like this is quite a good idea for building a little bit of strategy and making players very wary about crossing areas without thinking first. Either way, for now, let's toggle the overlay back off again. And I'm going to go back onto overlay and get my 32 meter grid on because I like working with it. And what I'm going to do is click on these splines and hold shift so I can select multiple ones at once. I can zoom all the way out, select all the roads on this map. That's all of them, and then hit assign to make sure that they are all the same ones. Now, something that we've looked at briefly before is that once you select a spline, you can actually go on to set optimum width. This one in particular will not change at all. However, if I were to shrink it, which, just in case you weren't aware, you hold shift and use the right mouse button instead of the left, I can shrink this road or expand it as I wish, as long as I'm holding down the right mouse button. If I overextend the width of this road and let go, I can fix the tiling so it makes the resolution much better, but set to optimum width will take it back to normal, and I'll just have to reset the width again. Now, because these roads are only supposed to be country lanes, I won't make them too big. We're not looking at a city here. But you can easily mix and match what types of splines you're playing with. For example, this one here, I could easily use the Road Sandy Spline 03 instead. And even though this one doesn't have a suffix cover, I know for a fact that it does still issue negative cover when used. I can use the overlay, terrain cover, and there it is. Now, this spline works quite well with the other one. It also works very well with dry, cracked ground and pebbles, so I'll keep it. But as for now, I think the rest of them, maybe this one can get changed as well, since it's only a small road. The rest of them will stay as they are. And that, for all intents and purposes, is the extent of the texture spline editor. Now, one thing that we haven't looked at yet, really, is object placements. And you may have noticed straight away that there is a very particular object here that wasn't there before. This is a spline. This is a custom spline that I've already built. Now, whenever you are building object splines, the trick is that you have to actually add the objects you want to use first. So it may help you to go looking in the object placement tool for objects that you want to turn into a spline before using this. The trick with using object splines is whenever you want to have a line of objects all perfectly synchronized together. So I know some people who will use these for rows of trees, but in all honesty I find that doing that makes everything look a little bit too uniform. It looks too perfect. But for fences and walls, this tool is ideal. So, let's assume that we don't already have this fence here. Make sure that you untick the texture spline editor and make sure you left click the object one. You're scrolling down, you'll come across two windows, default and current. Default is where you will be adding your new items to, whereas current will only show information when you click on a spline that actually has objects in it. So current is for editing splines you've already placed, and default is for creating new ones. If you scroll all the way down, you'll come across the usual menus that you'll find in the object placement tool, EBPS, SBPS, and Visuals. So, without further ado, let's jump into EBPS, jump into Environment, Art Ambient, Objects, Walls, Wood, and this is where we'll find most of our rural fences. Now, I'm going to replicate this one here, because this is a fence that I particularly like. It is old, it is battered, and it's very, very much man-made. It reminds me of a lot of fences around where I live, so it's one that I like adding into maps where I can. So, if you wanted to use the exact same example, scroll through the list and you should be able to find Old World Low Horizontal Fence 01, and the exact same but with O2. Click on an asset one by one, and then on the default window, click Add Object to List, and you'll see it pop up in the object window there. I'll go and get the second one and do the same. And there we have two objects now that are inside our object spline. Make sure you tick the button at the top so that it knows you're building an object spline, and with right click, create 4 nodes just as before, hit the enter key, and you have a fence. However, this one is actually slightly different. If I click on these, you'll be able to see the silhouettes and the outlines of the objects. Now, this particular fence is okay when it's out of wall mode, but if I grab another object instead, just to show you an example, if I delete these and I grab something like, I'll go on to stone instead, because that is a better example, I think. If I use brick S01, if I add that and do the exact same process, you'll notice that there are lots of gaps between these. Even though the boxes and the silhouettes line up, this isn't actually building a wall, it's just building several separate objects with gaps between them. And that's because on default and at the moment on current, wall mode isn't selected. Now you can select that before you actually place your spline, which we will do for future reference. But on this one, I want to turn wall mode on and hit apply changes. Now you'll notice the spacing between them only changed slightly, but on the brick one you'll notice it much more. As soon as I hit apply changes with the wall mode on, it actually becomes a normal wall. And that is important when we start looking at things like damage states, where you can actually destroy individual objects. If I click on this brick wall, there's 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, so 4 different assets all linked together, and if I were to destroy number 2, it would actually cause some minor destruction at the end of 1 and the end of 3, so that it looks like the wall has been blown apart. It won't just destroy 2 and leave 1 and 3 perfectly undamaged. What you'll also notice as well is that there is a button here, both on default and current, but we'll work with current now that we actually have our spline, that says adjustable to terrain. Now, while this is ticked, if I click and drag this all the way over to the slopes where our water is, you'll notice that the fence changes height based on the terrain that it's stood on. It's a very clever design where the fence posts will remain vertical, but the actual slats of the fence will shift and move depending on the height and the terrain. If I were to click this off, however, and hit apply, the fence disappears underground. I'd need to hold the H key and left click and drag to bring it back up to the surface. But now you'll notice that because adjustable to terrain is turned off, the fence will not change regardless of what shape the terrain is taking. This is particularly useful if you're building fences near ruined buildings and you want to build mounds of rubble with a height map editor, but you don't want the fences to suddenly pop up above the piles of rubble, because that would be unrealistic. Rubble would fall on top of the walls and the walls wouldn't suddenly respawn above them. However, for now, let's stick adjustable to terrain back on and hit apply and drag it back over to where we were working. Now, there are a few other options on here that don't appear in the other types of the spline tool. You'll notice as well that you can change the player assignment, which we won't bother about because we don't want these fences to belong to any team. But the random rotation can actually change the rotation that objects are placed in. We don't want our fence posts to be flying all over the direction, so let's keep it at 0. But the placement type we can order or random. Because we have 2 different types of objects here, making it random would actually be a good idea, because at the moment it's using type 01, type 02, type 01, type 02, and so on and so forth, which doesn't look realistic. If I go into random and hit apply, I'm clicking the wrong one. If I go into random here and then hit apply, you'll notice that some of them will change between 1 and 2. We can actually adapt this even more. If you look at the probability thing here that says prob, I can click the prob button and it will actually allow me to change the percentage. So let's make the chances of getting the old world fence 01 75% and the probability of getting 02 25%. If I now apply changes again, that is perfectly applied to this fence. And if I happen to hit the spacebar and extend this fence however I want, that same probability will apply on every new object which is added to the spline. What's also very useful to do, and I can't recommend enough, is create splines like this early on in your design, and then all you need to do is hold the C key and copy them and move them wherever you want. The same probability and the same spline will already be there, so you don't have to recreate them and add more objects to them as you go along. The last thing that I should mention here is the spacing, and this is a bit of a strange one. The spacing between objects in an object spline will change depending on what they are. The spacing between the objects on this brick wall are absolutely perfect. You can see a tiny, tiny gap between the objects, but in-game, that's barely noticeable. On this one, however, you might notice that where the nails are on the wood don't match up with the fence posts, and even though you might not really care about that so much, it can make a big difference on some objects where they look too far apart, even with wall mode on. On this example, what I've done is change the spacing so that the nails overlap with the fence posts. Makes them look a little bit more realistic. Sometimes it doesn't work, but other times it does. If you notice here on spacing, I've actually changed the original spacing to minus 0.1, whereas originally they all start at a flat 0. By doing that, using a minus number, make sure that it is only a small minus number, not something like minus 10. Minus 0.1 is more than enough here. It will actually move the objects closer together. If I didn't have this as a negative number, if it was just 0.1, they would move slightly further away from each other. So use that only if you feel like you have to. Okay, that is all we really need to know for now about the object placement tool, because we'll come to damage states later. And to wrap us up, what I wanted to do is move straight onto the deform spline. If I untick object and make sure I've left clicked deform, I can also tick the box on deform so it stays that way. This one has far fewer options, and in all honesty, the tool itself doesn't need much. What I can do is, as before, right click to create nodes on the deform spline, I hit enter, and you'll notice that nothing's really happened. If I hold shift and right click, I can adapt the size of this. I can use optimum widths and present widths if I wanted to, but honestly using the right click is probably easier when the shift key is held down. But what the deform spline does is mixes the spline tool with a height map editor. If I hold the H key, I can create large masses of land that go up and down however I wish. What you can also do is, if you edit the profile, you can create an actual profile that will change the shape of this. At the moment, the edges on this are very, very vertical. If I create an inverted dip, like this, by clicking on nodes, I can click and drag these and move them if I want to. Once I hit apply and OK, it will add that impression onto the spline. So I've created a small dip and it has done the same. Not much difference, but if I change the height, you'll start noticing it a little bit more. Now, this is very subtle. There's not much to this yet. But let's use it in a proper example. If I delete this for now, this road here could easily be a main road. What I'm going to do is add a deform spline to it. So it asks me if I want to remove the texture one, but I don't. I want to just add a deform. So this is now a deform and a texture spline. If I hold the H key, I can change the height of it, and the road texture will stay the same. I'm going to raise it ever so slightly, not very much at all, but again we have those straight edges. I'm going to edit profile, and I'm going to do the same thing and create a flat top, but rounded edges on it. I'm going to hit apply and hit OK. And this has created a bit of a concave design. This is the wrong way around really for a road. Camber on roads usually means the middle of the road is taller and the edges of the road are lower down so that water can run off them. So let's use the right click and delete those nodes. That's easy. And I'm going to left click and drag these nodes right down to the very bottom of the spline and do the opposite of what I did before. So I'm going to be building up like that. It doesn't have to be perfect either way, because this can be edited later, but now what our road should do is have smooth edges that curve towards the center of the road, and then have a flat top. I hit apply, you can see that's exactly what's happened. Smooth edges and a flat topped road, like normal country roads would be. The most important thing now, however, is to hit this button over here that says bake. And this is only really applicable to the deform spline. If you hit bake, you can no longer change the height mapping part. If I try and hold the H key and move up and down, it doesn't do anything anymore. If I move it, it doesn't actually move the height, it just moves the spline away, and the bump in the ground is left behind. I have turned this into a permanent feature. But what this also means is, I can now use the smoothing tool, lower the strength, maybe on 100, and I can actually smooth down what we've just done, so that it doesn't leave any jagged edges. It will still leave a slight bump on the road, but it means I can edit it. If you are using a deform spline and you haven't baked it, the height map editor will make absolutely no effect on it whatsoever. You have to bake it first to edit it. One last thing that we should really look at, if we go back to the texture spline that we haven't looked at before, is the Colorize button. Now this Colorize button is something that we didn't look at before, but is something that's definitely for more advanced steps. Now if you feel like you don't necessarily need to know this now, come back later. But if you are intrigued by what this means, on Colorize it will bring up two bars. The first one is your alpha bar, so the bottom, and the top one is your color bar. If I go on select all, I can change the alpha or the color and it will affect the entire spline. I can change the colour, and you'll notice this colour starts appearing in the very top bar here. I can hit apply, and it will change the active colour of the spline itself. If I want to make it green, I can do. If I want to make it blue, I can do. The idea is that every spline has a base colour to it that isn't necessarily white. This spline here is already quite pale reddish brown because it's a dirt road. If I add a little bit more very, very pale brown to it, it will make it darker. So it won't necessarily replicate the exact colour you choose, but it will merge the existing colour with one that you pick. I can also change the darkness and the shade of it with that bar there and hit apply. I can make a very dark road by comparison. But what you'll also notice is the alpha is only in black and white, and alpha essentially refers to the opacity. How transparent is the spline? White represents a completely solid colour, which is why the texture comes out quite detailed. If I go and select all again and I change the alpha down to pitch black and hit apply, the spline becomes invisible. If I make it halfway where it's grey, you can start seeing it, but again most of it's transparent. Now, what you would normally find whenever you build a new spline is that these nodes at the very edges here, these keyframes, they are black. And that's because at the edge of a spline, if we go right to the edge of this one, it fades out naturally. I can click these keyframes and drag them, and I can make that opacity last a little bit longer. Now, there you can see I've dragged the keyframe so much that this part here is starting to get a little bit transparent, which is probably more than we need. But similarly, you can also close the gap. And the more that you close it, the less opacity there is at the end. Now, you might not necessarily have a use for this yet, but if I were to give you an example of a very common spline that I use, if I go onto Road Dirt, and then onto Pebbly Spline, hit assign, I'm going to create 4 nodes, hit enter, and this, when I've got it all sorted, is a very, very common spline to use. At the moment it's very bright and very vibrant, but if I go into Colorize, I can click a node right in the center and then right click these keyframes so that the vast majority of this, besides the very center of it, will be almost transparent. And hit apply, and you'll notice that the area in the middle is very white, but the rest of it starts getting a bit faded and pale. If I also change the color to be slightly browny, maybe a bit darker than that, and hit OK, this is a very particular spline that I can use to line the edges of roads with to make it look like it's a pebbled country road. That shade that I've currently got blends in very nicely with the normal colour of this type of road spline. If I use Control and page up, I can actually move this spline onto the top of the list. The road is now underneath this spline, and I can mirror the textures back and forth on the X and Y axis. To shift it around, it will flip the image over until I like its positioning. And that is an excellent way of trying to blend in splines and tiles. Using several of the same spline, if I just flip the X and Y again so it doesn't look like the exact same thing, I can stretch it, cover over the edges of the road, and blend everything together quite nicely. And there we have it. That is it for part 6 of the World Builder Wiki video series. We'll be returning in the next step, as we'll be going into more advanced stages. We'll start looking at placing other objects that aren't necessarily basic objects. So we'll go past the groves and the buildings, and we'll start looking at things like barrels and crates. And we'll start looking at the different methods you can use in the object placement tool to make your map feel alive. Anyway, I hope to see you in the next step. See you soon.